Okay, good evening. Can everybody hear me okay? What?
Louder, please.
Louder? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So welcome to the annual, we don't do it every year, but most years we do a Heritage Commission annual program. And this year I'm pleased to have a co-presenter. Some of you were here last year and you were stuck with me the whole time, so you only have me for half of it this time. My name is Nathan Merrill. I'm the chair of the commission, and I'm pleased to introduce Monica Roos, and she's going to do the first half, and then I'll come back and talk about, I'll share with you some of the paintings from Stratham. So I think we all know why we're here. We're here to learn about Childe Hassam and his visit to Stratham between 1900 and 1918, so a little over 100 years ago. Monica is a fine art appraiser. She focuses on American paintings and prints from the 18th through the mid-20th century. She's a certified member of the Appraisers Association of America. She's a graduate of Sotheby's, New York's American Arts program. She worked for 20 years at Northeast Auctions in Portsmouth as the senior specialist responsible for paintings, sculptures, and prints. She's a treasurer and past president of the Piscataqua Decorative Arts Society and a member of the board of directors and the collections committee of the Museum of Old Newbury in Newburyport. So please join me in welcoming Monica to the front.
Okay. How is it in the back? Can you hear me? Well, good. So Nate's going to turn the lights down low. We'll get comfortable. Thank you for coming out on a cold night in between storms. I think someone is smiling on us so that we can kind of sneak in before the next round starts. So I'm going to start. I guess I'll start by learning how to use this. There we go. So I will start by saying that Childe Hassam was and is a very important artist in the history of American art. And to quote a very esteemed curator of American paintings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, who wrote a very lengthy book on him and mounted an exhibit on him a number of years ago. Here's what she had to say about Hassam. Childe Hassam was a pioneer of American Impressionism and perhaps its most devoted, prolific, and successful practitioner. And Hassam was actually a very successful artist in his own lifetime. At the end of the 19th century, an art critic put him right up in a triumvirate, what he called a triumvirate of American artists. So he chose Hassam, John Singer Sargent, and Winslow Homer. So he had quite a big reputation even before the 20th century started. So what I'm going to do is give you just a little background on Hassam and talk about some of the developments in the art world of the 19th century and some of the styles of painting that influenced him. And then we'll look at some examples of his work. And then I'll turn the podium over to Nate, and Nate will show you, I think, what everyone is curious to see these new discoveries of work that have been identified as having been done right here in Stratham. So to start, Hassam was born in Dorchester, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston, from a New England family that actually dates back to Puritan times, to the 17th century. So his name can sometimes be a little bit confusing. It's very exotic looking, very Middle Eastern. Even though he was extremely proud of his Puritan roots and his New England background, he liked to kind of keep people off balance, and he liked to pretend that he had some sort of Turkish ancestry. So you might wonder about the name Childe. First of all, his given name was Frederick, and Celia Thaxter, whom he met early on in his career, convinced him to drop Frederick because she thought it was too typical, and that Childe was a much more distinctive name. And of course, you tend not to forget it. So Childe is actually an old Saxon word for shield or knight, so very chivalrous. And his last name, Hassam, is a corruption of an Old English surname, Horsham. And Hassam was very proud of his New England ancestry. He considered New England to represent the essence of America. So Hassam had actually very little formal training. He learned art drawing and watercolor in high school, but he had to leave school before he even finished high school because his father was financially ruined in the Great Fire in Boston in 1872. So Hassam, as a teenager, left school and was placed in the publishing firm Little Brown's accounting department, and very quickly discovered that he was not suited to numbers at all. And his family did recognize that he had a talent for drawing, so they extricated him from the accounting department and apprenticed him to a Boston illustrator and engraver. And there, Hassam did a lot better. You see at the top, that masthead, Marblehead Messenger, was one of the early things that Hassam did as an engraver. And it's actually still in use today by a local newspaper in Marblehead, Mass. But he had to support himself. He couldn't take art classes during the day, as many of his cohorts, co-artists did. So he took classes at night at the Lowell Institute, at the Boston Art Club, and he actually attached himself to a number of working artists in the Boston area so that he could learn from them. And then eventually he took a trip to Europe, a pleasure trip, and was really initiated into the art world of France. So Hassam, as a personality, was a very outgoing, very sociable, happy, upbeat person. He was a member of many, many art clubs. He was a member of many artist colonies, and eventually he was a founder of a group of 10 artists called The 10. And they were American Impressionist artists who broke away from the more conservative vein of art in the country. He was also a very versatile artist. He worked in many, many different subjects, landscapes, cityscapes, figures. One thing he did not do a lot of, I thought, interestingly, was he didn't do a lot of portraits. And a lot of artists of his day supported themselves with portrait commissions. And Hassam just was not at all interested in that. Instead, Hassam worked very hard at promoting his artwork, marketing his artwork, exhibiting it. And of many of his colleagues, he probably exhibited more work than any of them combined. And he was very industrious. Over his lifetime, he produced over 2,000 oil paintings, watercolors, pastels, and book and magazine illustrations. And then later in life, he kind of went back to his early days as an engraver, and he began etching. And he produced over 400 etchings, and Nate will show you some of those that he did locally. So a very prolific artist, and someone who I think probably was a little bit antsy, couldn't sit still, liked hanging out with people, but was always working, always had a project going. And as you can see, even in his early years, he's a fairly accomplished watercolorist. Better? Better. He's fairly accomplished as a watercolorist, as you can see at the two bottom examples of his work. So in Hassam's lifetime, there were a couple of really important major schools of painting, styles of painting. The very first one, really, it's considered the first school of landscape art in America, was the Hudson River School, which started around 1825 and lasted all the way up to the Civil Wars, about 1860. And that school really was into majestic landscape because they believed that God could be found in nature. And so they were always looking for the sublime or the better, or the divine. So you've got a lot of a lot of drama. As you can see, the mountains, the sunset. They were also looking for things that they considered uniquely American as opposed to European. So they did a lot of paintings of Niagara Falls, a lot of actually White Mountain paintings, and of course the Catskill Mountains, which were beautiful, and they wanted to show that off. So the second influential style of painting in Hassam's time, which ran from about 1840 to 1870s, was called the Barbizon School. And this was a group of French artists who were very much into landscape also, but in a much more naturalistic way. They really weren't looking for drama. They really thought nature was a worthy subject in and of itself. And they were fascinated with the change of seasons, change of times of day, the effects of light, and really painted a lot more of an intimate, agrarian, and domestic scenes of people on the land. And then tonalism, which is a later school, 1880s to about, actually popular in the States until about 1920, is a much more dreamy, soft-edged, painted in darker tonalities, very muted atmospheric effects of light. And that was thought to be, to convey a feeling of contemplation and serenity. So this is an example of probably Hassam at his most Barbizon. This is, an everyday occurrence in an agrarian landscape, very beautifully done, and currently held by the Brooklyn Museum of Art. And then in 1884, Hassam took a pleasure trip to Europe. And one of the things he was exposed to was paintings of urban life, particularly in Paris. And he came home to the States, and he combined tonalism with urban life. And he produced these three images of Boston. He also moved to Boston. So the painting in the lower left, Columbus Avenue, was around the corner from where he lived in the south end of Boston. And these three images are so different, as you can see, from the Hudson River School of landscape painting. They were captivating, and they really have gone on to become landmarks in American art. The way he portrays cities, the way he portrayed the atmospheric conditions of snow, the softness and the quiet of a snowfall, and the sort of glistening pavement of a rain. Really beautifully done, really beautifully done. And then in 1886, Hassam left Boston with his wife and moved to Paris. And this is really the longest period that he had any kind of formal training. He studied in France, and he was exposed in a very big way to Impressionism, and really accepted it, loved it, really, and I think took in a lot of what the French Impressionists were doing, but created it in his own style. So Impressionism in France really began in the mid-1870s, and it really only took hold in America about 10 or 15 years later. So the Americans were always kind of a little bit of a generation behind the French. But the French Impressionists, as you probably know, rejected academic devotion in France to meticulous technique, smooth surfaces, and very classically structured compositions. And they were considered radicals. What they wanted to do is portray modern life in a very modern style that was very light and with a high key of color. They used pure color, and they would apply it separately in dabs so that the human eye would conflate the colors and you would see kind of shimmer, an optical illusion. And I should back up a little bit and say that one of the really foundational things that changed in the mid-19th century in art, in the art world, both in Europe and America, was a very, very seemingly ordinary thing. It was the invention of collapsible metal tubes for paint. And this was actually, I was surprised to discover this, invented by a man from New Hampshire. Little known artist, I think probably died penniless, didn't make any money off the invention, and certainly didn't make any money off his art. But he invented paint tubes, went to Britain to market them, and artists loved it because what they allowed was they allowed artists to work plein air outside and not in the studio, because they had a way of carrying art, paint, that didn't dry out because they had screw tops, and it allowed them to use many more colors than they had been able to use previously. So it was really revolutionary. And the Barbizon painters were really the first plein air painters of the 19th century. But the Impressionists really took this invention and ran with it. They were sort of like kids in a candy shop with the assortment of paint colors that they could use. They used them, and they used them with a vengeance. And this was shocking to the art establishment, really shocking. They applied paint in very rapid brush strokes because they wanted to give an impression of something. They didn't want to exactly reproduce. Because you have to remember, too, that with the invention of photography, which came along in, I think, the early 30s, cameras eventually could record nature and people in a more realistic way than many artists could. So the Impressionists thought, why are we beating ourselves up trying to do something that a machine can do better? We're going to be expressive. And so they wanted to create an impression. They liked informal composition, kind of what you see up here. And this is Hassam's wife mending in a window. And she's off to the left. And the paint cans kind of balance her in this composition in a very clever way. But it's something that you would never see in a Hudson River School painting. You would never see it in a classical French history painting. No, this was entirely new. Another thing that the Impressionists liked to use was very high horizon lines and plunging perspectives to make you feel like you're there. And they also used V shapes in their compositions, which really emphasized kind of a depth of field. And you can see that with the Monet. And you can see the Monet was painted in 1874, and then Hassam came along about 15 years later and did his version of Fifth Avenue in New York, using a lot of the same compositional techniques. One of the differences between French and American Impressionism is that the French really were very interested in capturing everyday middle-class life, whereas American Impressionists probably veered a little more towards the upper classes and the leisure classes. But Hassam totally embraced Impressionism, and he never let it go. Even into the 20th century, into like the 1920s and 30s, when modernism was rearing its ugly head, according to Hassam, he did not give up on his style of painting, and he became considered old-fashioned, and his reputation went into decline for a number of decades after he died because of that, because he was not a modernist painter. So here you have some examples of work by Claude Monet and Childe Hassam. Anyone guess which is Monet and which is Hassam? Well, I will tell you the painting on the left is the Charles River in Boston. And you can see the State House with the bullfinch gold dome in the distance. The painting on the lower right is Monet. But what about the painting in the upper right? That's Hassam. That's also Hassam. But, could be French. Could be French, definitely. And here's another Hassam. Could be French. The Pastoral and the Hassam, the 6th Avenue L in New York. I mean, beautiful tour de forces of nocturnal paintings. So Hassam moved to New York City in 1889. He left Boston. He came back from Paris. He went back to Boston and immediately packed his apartment up. It was sort of like, I've had it with this, this little cow town. I'm going to New York, because New York was the center of the American art world. He always kept his roots in New England, but New England came to be a summer destination. But he and his wife moved to New York. And from about that time, 1890, he began spending every summer in a different resort artist colony location in New England. And these included Connecticut, and you can see here Cos Cob and Old Lyme. Hassam particularly loved old architecture and old New England architecture, and he painted these kinds of churches many times. And the woman on the left, a colonial fireplace, very beautifully done. But he also painted in Gloucester and Cos Cob again. I mean, these beautiful, beautiful summer paintings full of light. But Hassam spent a large amount of his summer vacations at the Isles of Shoals. He had a more than 30-year association with the Shoals, starting in 1882 and running up until 1916. And I think he was introduced to the Shoals by Celia Thaxter. And Celia had kind of a salon going in her family owned one of the big hotels, and she gathered a large group of artists and writers, and Hassam was included with that. And he enjoyed the kind of intellectual stimulation, the sociability, and he kept coming back even after Celia Thaxter died. And he visited each summer between 1899 and 1916, every single summer. And that's kind of coincides with the period of time of where he spent time in Stratham as well. And he executed close to 300 works at the Isles of Shoals, and these include watercolors, oils, pastels, and drawings. And Shoals subjects make up probably about 10% of his entire artistic output. So a really, really important locale for him. And here you see Celia Thaxter in her garden, and then in her house, the Room of Flowers. If you look closely on the right, you see that kind of pink. That's a woman seated in like a sofa reading, but it's just, you can see that not only did she attract artists to her, but her house became a little bit of a gallery, and artists sold their work. You can see everything. You can see the walls are just completely loaded with artwork. So it was an important venue for Hassam. And here are a couple of more beautiful, beautiful examples of Hassam working on the shoals. And some of you may have seen the 2016 exhibit that the Peabody Essex did of Hassam on the shoals, which was an interesting look at not only his artwork, but also the kind of geology of the islands and how he portrayed them, and the kind of artistic license he took to put his paintings together. And Hassam was often unaccompanied when he went to the shoals. You get the impression that he liked hanging out with the boys' club. And he sometimes left his wife Maud here in Stratham with the Whitcombs. And then he would come back and pick her up and spend time. But it was a very convenient location because they were friendly. And then he could truck over to the shoals very easily. So Hassam's most productive period and most successful decade was 1909 to 1919. And again, this coincides with his visits to Stratham. And living in New York City during most of the year, with the rise of automobiles in cities that replaced horses and buggies, he really desperately was looking for a way out. He did not like the conversion of the natural world to cars and trucks. And so a lot of his work more and more turned to the pastoral and less to the urban scene of New York or Boston. And in 1912, he took up etching, which he had been done as an apprentice. And it offered him a whole new avenue for artwork. And you see here on the left, this is a doorway in Portsmouth. He did a number of other etchings in Portsmouth. And then on the right in Long Island, New York. And again, these two illustrate sort of lifelong loves and interests of Hassam. He loved old architecture. He loved trees. Many of his work centers around trees. And you can see also, again, that training he had from Impressionists of that V shape, digging into, that depth of field. So, lessons he learned and continued throughout life. And then with the outbreak of World War I, he painted a series of very patriotic flag paintings. These are just 3 examples, but there are many more. One of them is in the collection of the White House, one is at the Met. They're all New York scenes, Fifth Avenue, really beautiful, very colorful. And Hassam considered these among his best works, and you can see why. And then later in life, he and his wife bought a summer house in 1919 in East Hampton, Long Island, the edge of Long Island. And that marks the period of his not returning to the Isles of Shoals, not returning to Stratham. He went out on the island and he made a home out there. And you can see here again, loved old houses, an old farmhouse, trees on the main street of East Hampton. And so, these were abiding loves and subjects of his. So I think, this is a nice kind of segue into his work in Stratham. And I'll turn the podium over to Nate.
Try and make that stay. Thank you, Monica, and thank you, everybody. Hopefully we'll get this microphone to stay where it belongs. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with me or my family, several of whom are sitting in the front over there in the peanut gallery, we own the Stewart farm, which was the Whitcomb farm. And so this photo on the left is the earliest aerial photo that we have been able to find. So it's about 30 years after Hassam was in Stratham. The photo on the right is from the Whitcomb family, and it was dated 1911. So that's from a pasture out behind the barns. And that's the way the place looked back then. So in a thank you note that Hassam wrote to the Whitcombs after what I believe was his first visit in 1900, although I'm not 100% certain, he wrote, "It is surely the farm, for I am sure there is none more beautiful anywhere." And that's from somebody who traveled all over the world. As an artist, he really saw the beauty in the rolling landscape that makes up the farm. And there he is in my front yard. For those of you who are Strathamites and you're familiar with the trees on the driveway, you might notice how skinny they are. The Whitcombs planted those trees. So they were pretty young when Childe was standing there. This is what the house looked like when the Whitcombs were there. And that is another note on the right that Hassam wrote. That one is in French from the Appledore Hotel, which is Celia Thaxter's father's hotel. So here's the Whitcomb family. There were I should back up slightly. There were two generations of Whitcombs who owned the farm. And by the time Hassam was coming, Benjamin, the original owner, had passed away. So at this point, Charles, his son, and his wife Marie, who are in the center of these two pictures, owned the farm. And these are the two sons. Obviously, a photo on the left, they're grown men, and on the photo on the right, they're kids. And they also had a daughter, Dorothy. And Dorothy is important for a couple of reasons. One is that we're going to see a couple of portraits of her in a minute. And Monica mentioned how he didn't do many portraits, but he did two portraits of Dorothy. And also in the audience tonight, we have a descendant of Dorothy Whitcomb. So here we have Miss Dorothy Whitcomb. So the one on the left is an etching. It's a print held at the Metropolitan Museum when she was about 25 years old. And the one on the right is an oil painting when she was about 16 years old at the Smithsonian. And this is the only non-Stratham photo you're going to see in my part of the talk. But I included it because it's the Portsmouth Athenaeum, which many of you are familiar with in Market Square. At the bottom, you'll notice that it was done from nature in Miss Dorothy Whitcomb's car. And I called the Athenaeum, and they said this is the only Hassam work that they have in their collection. But she verified that was written on the reverse of the art. So now back to Stratham. This whole section will be etchings. This particular one is in the field behind the main house, the Whitcomb house. It's a row of hickories, and as Monica noted, he loved trees and featured trees in a lot of his art. And you'll see that theme throughout here. And the photo on the right is a contemporary view of that same scene. Some of those hickories survive, not as many, but some of them are still there. This is another one from a very similar spot. You'll notice I circled the house. You can see the house in the print and in the photograph. And also you can see in the rear, the trees along the driveway are much smaller in the print than they are in the current day photograph. The hay barn at Whitcomb Farm is the largest, physically the largest etching that Hassam did in his series of, and I don't know which Whitcomb barn it's picturing, but it was one of those two barns. And you can see it in the 1940s photograph. Benjamin Whitcomb had both barns built in the 1880s shortly after he bought the farm for his horse breeding operation. This is a clipping from the Exeter newsletter. Charles C. Flagg of Exeter, now visiting San Francisco, California, writes to a friend here that in the Palace of Fine Arts at the Panama Exposition, he found one room devoted to the works of Childe Hassam, a Boston artist of the modern Impressionist school. Among the pictures was one sketch of Newfields, taken from across the river, which attracted much attention. There it is. So here you have the old wooden drawbridge that stood where the current bridge is across the Swampscott River. And you also have today's College Road. Back then was Newmarket Road. And it has since obviously been widened and straightened and doesn't look anything like that. No, I have not been able to place it. Jumping across town, this is the old Winnicott Mill Pond. And the photo on the right was taken by my late cousin, Wally Stewart, in 1963. The mill and the dam are no longer there, so the pond is no longer there. And Wally's photo is slightly more south and west, so you see the barn from the neighboring farm in his photograph, which you don't see in Hassam's print, but that is the same general location. So this would be, for those of you who are unfamiliar, if you're going out Winnicott Road towards Northampton, it would be on the right-hand side as you cross the river. So now we transition to oil paintings, and I was stunned to find this. And it's in a private collection, unfortunately, in Houston, Texas. And all I could find of it was a black and white photocopy. And I was very fortunate to find out who owned it. And I wrote to her, she's an elderly woman, and I asked her if there was any way she could send me a photograph of the color painting. And she did, bless her. Because I really wanted to show this to all of you, because we all know that Stratham Hill is iconic in this town. Where it was done from, I believe, is probably at today's Barker's Farm or where Crestview Drive is today, somewhere in that general area. Now we're back to Stewart Farm, the Whitcomb Farm. This is again the same row of hickory trees, but looking down towards Millbrook and towards the river instead of the other way. There are two paintings here in that same general area. These are both in private collections. This one is special. Hassam is on the left, and John Samuel Blunt is on the right, from almost 100 years earlier. From the Newfields shore, Hassam did his painting from our land on the Stratham shore. but it's the same basic view 100 years apart and more than 100 years ago. So this is really a treasure, and I was thrilled to find this watercolor about a year ago. Now, I don't know if we have anybody from Newfields in our audience, but we have several images of Newfields, both oils and watercolors. This is an oil. It's at the MFA in Houston. The painting on the right is at the Courier in Manchester, and for a long time, this was the only Hassam work that my family was aware of existing from the farm. All these other things are new discoveries. The one next to it is in a private collection, another watercolor. Again, another watercolor of Newfields and a contemporary photo. You can't see the buildings as well from a camera, plus the trees have grown up a lot more on the other side. Two more watercolors of Newfields done 6 days apart. He clearly was really awed by that, by the scenery over there. It's a very picturesque village. This is again in the field behind the Whitcomb house, looking towards Millbrook and the Squamscott River. Done about a year apart. I regret that one on the right I only have available in black and white. You'll notice in the distance, in the center, there's a barn. Here again is Wally Stewart to save the day, because that barn doesn't stand there anymore, but there it is. And that bridge you see there replaced the wooden drawbridge you saw earlier, not long after Hassam did the drawbridge print. It was in the early 1920s that the first steel bridge was built. So there's that same watercolor again with the barn circled, and you can see the contemporary photo. The barn is not there. So the rum cherry tree. I thought there might be a variety of cherry called the Brum. The legend goes, and I had this confirmed today by Dory King, was that Hassam and Charles Whitcomb were drinking buddies. And when I was asking around about the rum cherry tree, an old-timer told me that no, there were also rum maple trees, rum oak trees, rum chestnut trees. The tree is no longer there, but I took the picture from the spot where I believe it was. Again, these two are both in the field behind the main house, looking down towards the river. Two different viewpoints. This one is at the MFA in Boston. They're not typically on display, unfortunately. But again, that same row of hickory trees that you saw in the etching earlier. And then this one here, we just lost a few of the trees that were standing over. That's why I faked it and put them back. But this is a different part of the farm. It's the only picture I've found of his that is from this particular part of the farm. And this is the old laneway that went back to the original ferry that crossed between Newfields and Stratham before there were any bridges. And lastly, we have the Old Elm, Stratham, New Hampshire. None of us has any idea where it is. But this was what Stratham looked like. Largely a rural agrarian town with elm trees lining many of the streets, especially Portsmouth Avenue. This was probably most likely somewhere along Portsmouth Avenue, but I have no way of knowing. And I don't think anybody in this room does either, probably. And that is the end. Thank you. Monica and I are happy to take some questions if you have any questions. Yes?
How did he know the Whitcombs?
I didn't. The history of the farm itself is another whole presentation, and that's coming. But so by I can't answer your question. I'm being a wise butt. There, in addition to Dory King, who's a Whitcomb descendant, in the room with us, there's another Whitcomb descendant, Barbara Stewart, different spelling, the EW spelling, who is a retired veterinarian in Pennsylvania. She came to the farm with her husband a few years ago, and I met her, and so that was my first introduction to a living Whitcomb. Dory says she also came about 30 years ago and met my grandparents. So anyway, we knew the Whitcombs owned the farm back then, but we didn't have any personal connection. The Stewarts didn't move to Stratham until 1961. So there were two other owners of the farm in between the Whitcombs and the Stewarts.
How did Hassam know them? Yeah, how did Hassam know?
How did Hassam know them? We don't know. They were both in Boston. Charles Whitcomb and Hassam both studied in Europe. They both came from Boston. I don't know.
One of Hassam's letters to another fellow artist who worked on the Isles of Shoals mentions that his wife, Hassam's wife Maud, was staying with her friends, the Whitcombs. And so it could be that the connection came through Maud Hassam first, and then Childe and Maud became personal friends, but we don't really know.
Yep. Thank you, Monica. Any others? Yeah?
I'm thinking Mr. Whitcomb, Charles was a pretty distinguished architect and builder.
So Benjamin,
Okay.
the first Whitcomb, the senior Whitcomb, was an accomplished builder. He built, ironically, the first Museum of Fine Arts in Boston building. Not the one that is standing today, but the original. He also built the expansion of the State House, and that is when he died, was when he was working on that project. Multiple major commercial and religious buildings in Boston, as well as a bunch of the houses in the Back Bay, a lot of the building that occurred in the late 19th century, Benjamin Whitcomb was doing in Boston. He was very wealthy. And then, and Charles and Marie, Charles was Boston Fire Commissioner. He was a city councilor first, and then he became Boston Fire Commissioner, and then he became the first Massachusetts Fire Marshal for the Commonwealth. And then later in life, he did a lot of speculating in mining, oil, coal, timber, and they lived very well. They had servants, they lived high on the hog, and spent the fortune, and then sold the farm in 1919 to avoid bankruptcy. Yes, over there.
Can you talk a little bit about your search? Are the works well cataloged? Was it easy to find these? It sounded like some were harder to find than others.
Remarkably hard. Late in this project, about 6 or 9 months ago, I finally was able to connect with the people in New York City who were doing the catalog raisonné. So they were very helpful in connecting some final dots. But I spent a fair amount of time just searching museum collections online, and but yes, it was kind of a labor of love. Yes.
What started you on your research?
Just a gut level of interest. Just wanted to know. Just started digging. Yes.
I noticed, I've done a little research on those paintings and, of Newfields from the farm, and I saw that there were a number of them in museums around the country, and the style changed over time, which was very interesting. Do you have any idea how many he did of that view?
Of Newfields, I think there's 7 that I know of, that were included here, that I'm aware of.
I saw one in the Newbury Street Gallery. You might remember me telling, yeah.
Mm.
I guess that was probably around 2000.
My guess is there are more that we just don't know about. These works that are in private collections. He was such a prolific producer that, you know, things are going to turn up. They're going to continue to turn up. And a lot of museums even, they don't have all their catalogs online yet. So, yes, yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not really from this town, but is this farm still in existence?
Yes. Yes.
And you live there? Okay. got it.
Today we milk cows there. The Whitcombs had horses. Benjamin Whitcomb was a horse sulky racer and bred race horses. They also bred a renowned herd of Jersey cattle as well, which I didn't know until more recently. But and then in between, the Bakers had dairy and bottled their own milk, and then after that, the Christies had poultry, and then the Stewarts bought the farm in the 60s and brought dairy back. Yeah.
I just would share, when my family moved here, I'm Lorraine Stewart Merrill. And my family moved here in 1961. It wasn't long before my mother wanted to take all of us 5 kids to see the Courier Gallery in Manchester. She was curious about it, and I'll just never forget, I was 10 years old, and we walked in the then front door of the Courier Gallery and started to look around a little bit, and my mother was immediately drawn to this painting right to the side of the front door. At that time, she went over and looked at it, and she was just emotionally, she recognized that it was the view from her kitchen window. And she was so excited, you know, the Childe Hassam, she was just, so ever since, you know, we've had a lot of curiosity about the relationship of how, you know, how does this happen? And it's been really, really fun to see what Nathan's been able to dig up, and all the people that we've connected with that have filled in a lot of blanks, so.
Thank you all very much. Oh, yeah.
Put the first slide up again.
The first one? That one? No? This one here? So that's not Stratham.
No, but it's a nice mark.
But it's a nice marsh. It's a nice estuarine environment. Yes.
Nate, just out of curiosity, how many working farms are left in Stratham now? Do you know?
1 dairy farm, several working vegetable and fruit farms, and some flowers. But yeah, I believe, I don't see Doug and Stella Scammon here tonight, but I believe Doug Scammon said that when he was growing up here in the 40s that there were 35 dairy farms. Don't hold me to that exact number, but in that neighborhood. Well, thank you all for coming. It's been a pleasure to have you.